Welcome, friends, to another Global Capitalism live economic update, a presentation we make every other month that is sponsored by Democracy at Work and by the Left Forum. Before jumping into our topic for today, which is a rapidly changing world economy that we're going to look at in detail, I wanted to explain and to apologize for a delay. Normally, this presentation would have been premiered on the second Wednesday of the month, which would have been May 10th. But two phenomena intervened that made us postpone until now what would have otherwise happened earlier this month. Number one, and the more important, I got COVID. I've never had COVID before, and it really knocked me down for a good 10 days, including the 10th of May. So that had to be postponed because I was literally too ill to make the presentation. Plus, I had to be sequestered and not in contact with other folks. And the second reason is a reorganization inside Democracy at Work, the organization that presents these talks every other month. And so the combination of the COVID illness and the reorganization, both of which will be behind us by the time we meet again on the second Wednesday of July. So I do ask your understanding for the exceptional circumstances that made this presentation 3 weeks late. Okay, I want to turn then to our topic, which is a fast-changing world economy. And let me stress, what I am describing is not something distant. The world economy is no longer something far away, if it ever was. It is now an ongoing reality that shapes everyone's daily life. From China to Canada, from Mexico to Paraguay, everywhere in the world is affected by the world economy because we are now an integrated, economically speaking, an integrated planet. And we have to learn to deal with the world economy because of its immediate impacts on us. It's in that spirit that I want to talk with you today about the big, rapid changes going on in the world economy. First of all, there really are now two major economic blocks or units that confront each other in a clear dichotomy that was never as clear as it is today. On the one hand, you might say the old dominant block of the world economy, currently called the G7. Basically, that's the United States, its Western European allies, Canada, and Japan. That's a bloc. It is very rich. It is very powerful. It has been the dominant economic reality with especially dominant role for the United States for many decades. But there is now another bloc, and we all have to get used to what that means. The other bloc, for lack of a similar designation, I'm going to call the BRICS nations, BRICS. And I want to make clear not only who's in the BRICS, but why and how it is the other bloc. First of all, what do the letters stand for? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS nations. And from everything I can gather, there's at least another dozen countries, including very large ones, that are applying to join the BRICS. But even before we look at who else might be joining, there's something remarkable about the BRICS that has to be spoken to right now. India and China are the two largest countries on this planet by population. Russia is the largest country on this planet by geography. Any association of countries that have the two most populous and the one with the largest geography would have to be taken seriously. The BRICS have been there as a group for some years, most of which they were not taken seriously. But now, over the last year and a half, they've become much more serious in the eyes of everyone in the world, with the exception of those, and we'll come to that at the end of today's talk, who have a vested interest in pretending not to see what's going on. Let me dramatize the importance of the BRICS beyond what I have said. The year 2020 was a crucial marker of something. In that year, the total GDP, gross domestic product, of all the G7 nations, the United States and its allies, was about the same as the total output of goods and services, the total GDP of the BRICS. They were about the same. The BRICS had been rising as a percentage of the world's output, and the G7 had been declining. And in the year 2020, the two lines crossed, which means that when I tell you what the situation is now, midway through 2023, the G7 has continued to decline. That is, the proportion of the global output of goods and services accounted for by the G7 nations, the United States and its allies, is now below 30%. Whereas the total GDP of the BRICS nations is today approximately 33%. In other words, the G7 is no longer the dominant producer of goods and services in the world economy. It has fallen to second place, and falling is what it has been doing for quite a while and gives every sign of continuing to do so. I might dramatize that fact by comparing the GDP growth in the United States in the first quarter of 2023 with the GDP growth in the first quarter of 2023 in China. In the United States, that rate of growth annualized 1%. In China, 4.5%. You see the direction of change. And this is important because it means that for every country in the world, and for most of the businesses in every country that either are involved in the export of goods and services or in the import of goods and services, the world economy is changing in the sense that the BRICS countries are becoming more and more important as sources of capital, as trading partners, relative to the G7, who are becoming less and less important. And much of today's talk will be elaborating the implications of this split and changing world economy. I want to turn next to the military aspects of all of this. And I think they are important. In a way, the long-term decline of the economic importance of the G7 nations has had a kind of parallel, militarily speaking, coming to a crescendo over the last 18 months. But I think the history of military conflicts after World War II tells us something. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Each of those involved a defeat for the United States militarily. It did not achieve many of the objectives, each of those wars, that the United States set out at the beginning. It should have been clear that the danger of using nuclear weapons meant that these would be wars fought in Asia, land wars, and that the United States would be at a disadvantage even with the enormous preponderance of economic and political wealth and power that it wielded coming out of World War II. But one might have overlooked those signs in the wind, were it not for what has happened over the last 18 months. Russia invaded Ukraine, and a war commenced in February of 2022, still ongoing, that pits Russia on one side and Ukraine partly on the other side. I say partly because Ukraine is now totally dependent economically, politically, and militarily on the United States and to some degree the NATO partners of the United States. And again, because nuclear weapons are insane and off the table, at least one hopes, we are left with a land war, Russians against Ukrainians, supplied by U.S. and NATO. And so the U.S. and NATO made a decision, a strategic decision, to militarily equip the Ukrainians, but to rely more on an economic war against Russia. And therein lay a strategic mistake, which it is clear to most of the world is playing out now. Here's the mistake. Russia is part of BRICS. The BRICS is a real alliance of countries who have a determination that there needs to be a change in the world economy, one that is symbolized and measured by the decline of G7 relative to the ascent of the BRICS. Long story short, Russia could shift the export of oil and gas from Europe, the now enemy, over to China and India, partners in BRICS, and thereby evade most of what the sanctions applied against Russia were designed to accomplish. In addition, Russia could turn for all kinds of direct and indirect supports, means of evading sanctions, means of going around sanctions, blunting the political effects of the invasion of Ukraine. All of this was done in good part because of the power of BRICS, because of the number of countries that seek to join BRICS and therefore do not want to alienate one of the key players in BRICS, namely Russia. The whole landscape of economic conflict has changed, giving Russia a level of support that made the statements by President Biden and many others that the economic war against Russia would collapse the ruble, would bring that country to its knees. None of that has happened. And the repeated escalation of the weapons deliveries to the Ukrainians, which have not achieved a military victory, have also not done much to change the basic economic stalemate, because that's what it is, since the objective of crushing the Russian economy is nowhere in sight. That's a sign and a measure of the changing world economy. And here comes another one. As you'll see, I'm able to present to you quite a list. The next one is called dollar or de-dollarization of the world economy. What do I mean? After World War II, the global economy was so dominated by the United States that the United States currency, the US dollar, became the global currency. So, for example, central banks around the world, seeking to hold reserves that would give confidence to anybody doing business in the currency of that country, they would hold in reserve gold, the global value behind money at the time, and the dollar, which was deemed literally to be as good as gold, as valuable as gold. So central banks held reserves in gold and held reserves in US dollars. Something like 80-90% of global central banks' reserves were in dollars. Today, that number is less than half. Under 45% of the world's central bank's reserves are in US dollars. Gold, euros, Japanese yen, Chinese yuan, they are replacing, and they're not alone, they are replacing the US dollar. And the pace of that replacement has accelerated, most of it happening in this century, that is, since the year 2000. But this is not all. The dollar is less and less used these days compared with 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 60 years ago. The dollar is much less used in international trade. Goods and services and investments moving from one country to another, often in the past, were handled with dollars. The world had to hold on to dollars. Businesses had to hold on to dollars all over the world because their regular business was conducted in dollars. Saudi Arabia took the initiative, with the support of the United States, in creating the so-called petrodollar, an arrangement in which much of the world's trade of oil, a central source of energy, was conducted in dollars, paid by country A that needed to import oil to country B that needed to export it. And that, of course, meant that you had to keep dollars to buy and handle the energy requirements of your economy. More and more, literally every week now, announcements are made where countries, including Saudi Arabia, are changing over and trading oil for other currencies. China's currency, Europe's currencies, even the currencies of Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries. And this has enormous consequences. The simplest one to understand is this. The United States has been subsidized by the world's use of its currency. One way to see it is to understand that when foreign countries send goods and services to the United States, wine from France, software programs from Japan, minerals and so forth from Asia and Africa and Latin America, and they pay for them with dollars, they're paying with a very cheap piece of green paper. Costs literally nothing. We get the fruits of labor. We get the creativity of the productive apparatus of the world for Americans to consume, for American businesses to use as inputs to their own production, and all we as a nation have to give in exchange is totally costless pieces of green paper, the dollar. And then we get a double subsidy. Because, of course, as all the dollars go out to pay for all the goods we import, and those dollars accumulate in the banks, the private banks, the central banks of other countries, they don't want to hold on to a dollar that pays them no interest. They need to hold on to access to dollars. They need to be able to get those dollars because they need them to buy oil and to do the world's business. But they're not earning anything while they hold the dollars. So know what they do? They turn around and take those dollars and lend them to the United States government. They buy treasury bills, and thereby they fund the budget deficits of the United States. They enable the United States government to tax corporations and the rich much less than they otherwise would have to. It's a subsidy to corporations and the rich, as running the deficits always has been. That is the reality of the double benefit that the dollar as world currency once conveyed on the United States, but the United States is now losing that subsidy, losing the ability to borrow the way it once did, discovering that it's going to be harder to finance the deficits of the future U.S. government than it was in the past, because the dollars are not out there waiting anxiously to be lent to the U.S. government as their way of holding the dollar. What will we see in the place of the dollar? Well, basically, there's one of two things. Either the Chinese yuan, because China is the great other of the United States. The U.S. and its allies, that's G7. China and its allies, that's the BRICS. But we're going to see a new currency replace the dollar, either the Chinese currency or, if they can do it, a composite, a new international currency that will be backed by a bunch of countries, not just by one. You know, we were used to the British pound during the British Empire being the global currency, and the US dollar being the global currency during the heyday of the American Empire. It will be an interesting question whether the emerging China/BRICS global dominance economically will make one or a basket of currencies function as the global exchange medium in the future. Another dimension of the fast-changing world economy that I want to bring to your attention is the role of China in two basic ways. China is the emerging economic powerhouse. Everyone in the world who pays attention knows that. And one of the interesting ways in which China is playing this emerging powerful role is by becoming a global peacemaker. By far the most dramatic evidence of that was the role of the Chinese in bringing together the bitter enemies Iran and Saudi Arabia, who have been bitter enemies for a long time, and efforts to overcome their enmity, insofar as the United States made such efforts, were clearly unsuccessful. The Chinese did it. They have now exchanged ambassadors, and the secondary and tertiary consequences of peace between those two countries are playing themselves out in the headlines every day. Why is this important? Well, the symbolism could not be stronger. The United States, which liked to position itself as global hegemon, global peacemaker, if possible, has now been challenged by another country playing that role in the same tumultuous Middle East where the United States fancied itself in that role. It now has to share the spotlight if it doesn't lose the spotlight altogether. But beyond the symbolism of peacemaker, there's something else going on here. The fact is that over the last 30 to 40 years, we've had, relatively speaking, peace. Yes, we've had wars. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and so on. But these wars were well localized, mostly in Asia, not only, but mostly, but localized. In the general global perspective, these were decades of peace. And the Chinese are acutely aware that their rise from a poor third world country with the added burden of being the most populous country in the world, that their incredibly rapid ascendancy to being the great competitive challenger of the United States took place over 40 years of relative, globally speaking, peace. They want the peace because it has worked very well for them. They did not have to disturb their own economy by going on to a wartime footing. They did not have to debit their own economy to move militarily around the world. They don't have foreign bases. They didn't create any. They didn't have foreign adventures. They didn't create any. They could and did devote themselves to economic development with a kind of focus that has something to do with the extraordinary performance they have shown us. They have become, ironically, advocates of an open world economy, of globalizing continuously. Here's the irony some of you should enjoy. On the one hand, the term neoliberalism and the term globalization went hand in hand over the last 30 to 40 years. They were the ideological way of saying how happy Western capitalists were in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, with the arrival for them of a vast new cheap labor force. It's a capitalist dream. China was bringing its enormous population and presenting them to global mega corporations, capitalists. Here, come to China, and in a lesser extent, come to India, come to Brazil, and you will have very hardworking people who are willing to accept much lower wages, and that will be a profit bonanza for you. And it was. The last 30 to 40 years, our stock market booms in the Western capitalist area. But while that boom for the West was the driving force, China was making its own way forward, using the neoliberal globalist arguments of an open economy, of having capitalists come to China to produce there what they would ship back to their own countries. China became the producer for the world. China's manufacturing exploded. China did better with neoliberalism and globalization than the West, who invented those words and who invented the thrust into that part of the world for reasons of profit maximization. Marx and Hegel would smile and remind us of the contradictions that beset whatever happens in the world. Yes, neoliberalism and globalization were phases of capitalism growing, of capitalism having its exploitative relation with labor become global. But the ironic contradiction was it made it possible for China to gain even more out of this capitalist initiative than the capitalists themselves. So we get the ironies flower. In today's world, as the United States and Europe begin to comprehend that China made more out of neoliberalism and globalization than they did, they are abandoning neoliberalism and globalization, aren't they? They're becoming nationalistic. Not just Mr. Trump with his tariff war against China, not just the trade wars against China, but even though Trump is gone for the moment and Biden replaced him, Biden continues and, if anything, intensifies a turn away from neoliberalism, a turn away from globalization, and the embrace of a new kind of economic nationalism in which the United States government, now followed by European governments and so on, are turning inward, eager to subsidize their own industries and enterprises. Laissez-faire is a vague memory. Active government intervention is the name of today's economic politics. That's a reaction to the world economies changing that will have many, many repercussions in the years to come, not the least of which will be the painful discovery by capitalists in Europe and North America that if they really intend to follow through, one of two things has to happen. Either they will have to pay the wages that are still relatively high in Western Europe and the United States, and therefore be unable to compete very well with those enterprises that have the advantage of lower cost labor. Or they will drive down the wages in Western Europe and North America, but that risks producing a militant labor movement that can challenge capitalism from within. Which way that's going to work out, either way, poses enormous problems which the current rush away from neoliberalism and globalization and into economic nationalism is making people misunderstand. But we're going to have to live through the denouement that comes, the awakening that what we didn't pay attention to is going to shape our daily life all around the world. The next aspect of the changing world economy focuses even more on China. I had mentioned that China in two ways is shaking the world economy. I've mentioned the one. Now I want to deal with the other one. And the other one has to do with how the world economy is making sense of what happened in China that enabled them, the Chinese, to make such advances during the period of neoliberal globalization. Why did this capitalist strategy, this capitalist initiative, this capitalist mechanism for profit maximization, why and how were the Chinese able to take advantage of that in the way that they did? And the answer is, I think, to be found in both the unique successes and the unique failure of the People's Republic of China. First, the success. China broke from the Soviet Union, which in many ways was a kind of model for it. And China also broke away from the United States, which in a different manner was also a model for it. And in the two breaks, I think you can find the key to China's growth success. First of all, the break from Russia, from Soviet Russia. In the Soviet Union, the government moved in and took over the ownership and operation of Russian industry. The 5-year plans, the Council of Ministers, the government became the owner-operator of industrial production. Agriculture, much less so, and only later. But industrial governmental ownership and operation was a core commitment starting already in the 20s and really getting going in the 1930s and since. China did not do that. China did not. China allocated, accepted, encouraged, and financed private capitalism alongside state-owned and operated industrial enterprises. That's a break from the model of the Soviet Union. At the same time, and in the same way, the Chinese broke from the growth on capitalist model, if you like, of the United Kingdom, the United States. And in a parallel way, it did not focus on, prioritize private industrial enterprises in industry that were owned and operated by private individuals, individual persons, individual families, or individual shareholders via the stock market. China didn't have an overwhelmingly state-owned and operated industry, nor an overwhelmingly private industry. No, what China did was unique and original. It really developed its own hybrid mixture of private and public enterprises in industry, and both of them subordinated to an effective control from the Chinese Communist Party. When the Chinese refer to their own system as quote-unquote socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is that hybrid and that supervisory control of a political party, a powerful political party, that is the unique, original, strategic form that Chinese economics took. And it is crucial to how they were able to utilize the neoliberal globalist period of capitalism to outgrow the very capitalism that put us in a neoliberal globalist phase. But I said it was also a failure. In what sense was it a failure? Well, I think the way to understand that is to draw a comparison between Lenin, a key leader of the Soviet Union, and Xi Jinping, the current leader of the People's Republic of China. You might think of Lenin as having faced the following situation. Early in the history of the Soviet Union, after all, I'm sure you all know that Lenin died a very few years after the Russian Revolution, so anything he said would have had to be said in the early period of the Soviet Union. He referred to what they had achieved by their revolution as, and I quote, state capitalism. And he said that the challenge faced in Russia at that time, in Soviet Russia, was the capacity or not of the Soviet Communist Party. The challenge it faced was making the transition from the state capitalism that they had constructed out of the revolution into a genuinely socialist, post-capitalist economy. In other words, would the party enable the Soviet Union to get beyond state capitalism? In point of fact, the party and the Soviet society were never able to go that next step. There are many reasons. My colleague Stephen Resnick and I wrote a book a few years ago trying to explain why they couldn't make that step. But here I want to confront you and our Chinese brothers and sisters with a parallel challenge facing Xi Jinping and the Chinese society now. They have erected a hybrid, a unique, original society, split between a private capitalism and a state capitalism. And let me be clear about why I call them capitalism, why I call all of these capitalism, whether they're in the United States or in China, whether they're state or private, because they have one thing all in common. It's that one thing that Karl Marx focuses on in Capital Volume 1, the centerpiece of his adult, mature creativity. What makes capitalism capitalist is that unique relationship between a small group of people who make the decisions, the employer class, the capitalist class, the entrepreneur, whatever you want to call them, on the one hand, a minority, a small minority, and on the other, a vast majority, the proletariat, the working class, the employee class, whatever you want to call them. Enterprises governed by that dichotomy, a small, powerful, wealth-accumulating governing group and a mass employee group producing the profits that minority gathers and disposes of. Going beyond that, having an economic system in which the enterprise is a community of equals, one person, one vote, a cooperative enterprise, a workers' cooperative, a workers' self-directed enterprise. That was the challenge Lenin faced, and that is the challenge Xi Jinping and the others in China also face. And they haven't made the transition. They never did in the Soviet Union. And the question for China is, can you make that turn? Will you make that transition? They haven't done so yet. And that may be more than is reasonable to have expected, given that they're a society that begins to move in these directions only after the Civil War is won in 1949. But the question imposes itself by the very history. And let's put it differently, however this question is answered in and by China will shape the whole world economy, whether they accept the challenge and move and make that transition or they don't. Either way, the Chinese, given their position in the world today, are going to shake everything and everyone. Okay, by way of conclusion, I want to talk about the rapidly changing world economy in terms of how it is being processed, understood, particularly here in the United States, which I'm in the best position to try to understand because I live and work here in the United States. And I've had some help recently, which is so interesting that I want to bring it to your attention. A very well-respected, nonpartisan polling institution is called PEW, Pew Research Center. And they did a poll here in the United States of a large number of randomly selected American citizens. The poll was conducted between March 27th and April 2nd of the year 2023. So it's just a few weeks old. And the Americans polled were asked the following question. Please compare this year, 2023, with what you believe will be the situation in 2050. That is 27 years from now, the future, in that sense. We want you to look into the future, look to the year 2050, and answer 4 questions. I'm going to give you the question and then give you the percentage answers that the American people gave. Question number 1. Will the United States economy be weaker or stronger in 2050 compared to what it is today? 66% of Americans said that the U.S. economy will be weaker. 32% said it will be stronger. 2 to 1, over 2 to 1, saying that they believed the United States would be weaker. In terms of today's presentation, that the decline of the G7, in the view of most Americans, will continue. Second question. Will the United States be less important in the world or more important in the world in 2015 compared to now? 71% said that the United States will be less important than it is today. 27% said it would be more important. Third question. The United States will be more politically divided in 2050 or less politically divided. 77% said more politically divided. 21% said less so. And the fourth and final question. The gap between rich and poor in the United States will grow or it will get smaller. 81% of the American people believe the gap between rich and poor will be worse, will be larger in 2050 than it is today. I want to draw a conclusion, in conclusion, for today. The American people understand, maybe not the facts and the figures, maybe not the particular details, maybe not the speed or rate at which the changes are happening, but they clearly understand that the world is changing in ways that diminish externally and internally what the United States once was and what it is fast becoming less of. And I want to contrast that with the statements and I believe the beliefs of the leaders of the United States. Not just the Republican and Democratic Party politician leaders, but much of the mass media, much of the academic world, they too are engaged in something which really has no nicer name than a massive quantity of denialism. They don't want to see what is going on. Or if they see it, they pretend it isn't significant. Or if they can find some statistic that makes things look better, they hype those statistics in order to avoid confronting the kinds of issues I have tried to present here. In some ways, even more impressive than the relative decline of the United States and the G7 relative to China and the BRICS. Perhaps even more important in the long historical run will be this gap in the understanding, in the consciousness of the people who have to live the decline versus the people who make their living pretending and insisting that that decline isn't happening or isn't going to have mammoth effects. My own conclusion, and I leave you with that, is that the pace of change, the rise of the BRICS, the collapse of the dollar, the rise of China, the outcome so far of the Ukraine war, these are powerful messages and measures of a fast-changing global economy. A famous leader once said to his associates who were complaining that there wasn't enough change, he said to them, for decades, nothing seems to happen. Nothing much changes. Then, in a few weeks, decades happen. I'm quite convinced that in the world economy we now live in, we are experiencing weeks during which decades are happening. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope these presentations on global capitalism meet with your expectations, and in any event, I look forward to being with you again for the next installment on the second Wednesday evening of the month of July 2023. Thank you.